Hello, my darling, and welcome to day 21 of 100 Days of Self-Love. Today, we're going to look at a kind of, bear with me on this one, but if you can grasp what I mean, it really can change your mental narrative. So today, we're looking at changing your mental narrative, the way that you speak to yourself, that shit FM, by sticking to the facts. Buddhists explain suffering as two arrows. The first arrow is the unfortunate event that happened, a painful arrow outside of our control. So let's say, for example, that your sad thing, but your dog gets poorly and the vet says, it's touch and go. We don't know if he's going to make it or not. And, that's really painful, but it's outside of our control. The second arrow is the story we tell ourselves about that event. So, for example, and that suffering is very much self-inflicted. So self-love is not shooting ourselves with that second arrow. So, for example, the first arrow, as I said, could be unfortunately one of your pets gets really, really poorly, and you take it to the, you kind of hang around, you wait and see if it gets any better. And by day 3, it's really not doing very well. So you take it to the vet and it's not good news. That's the first arrow, okay? The second arrow could be telling yourself that the pet would be all right if you'd have taken him sooner, that if you hadn't have given him that food that you bought on the way home because you were running late, it might have been, if you'd have not taken him to that park, he would, and we start giving ourselves a hard time. And it's like stabbing ourselves with this second arrow, shooting that second arrow at ourselves. So, despite the fact, so in other words, a situation can be emotionally painful, of course, but, the story we tell ourselves about it is actually quite often the main source of our suffering. So the good news is we can all work on that narrative, and it's by sticking to the facts, okay? So if negative thoughts start seeping in about a painful event, if we look at the facts and we say to ourselves, is there any evidence against those thoughts? Is there anything that you can identify that makes things less bleak? You're not denying reality. This is not about denial, okay? But what you are doing is pointing out all the things that exist at once. So let's say, for example, you were made redundant. Does that mean that you're bad at your job? Is there any evidence that proves it had nothing to do with your performance? Or perhaps your performance at work suffered due to challenges outside of your control? Or maybe you weren't great at your job because it's a bad match for your skills and strengths and you got put into a different department that you didn't really want to be in. But does that mean you're a bad person? No. So by identifying all of the facts, you're better able to recognize what you are and are not in control of, and to avoid letting a challenging event define your self-worth. Okay, does that make sense? So another way to challenge our inner narrative is to ask ourselves, where are those thoughts coming from? Okay, so for example, social media posts. Don't you just love them perfect mums on social media? Beautiful. Or the women that just look like they've got all their shit together and just like perfectly groomed every single day. But they can often trigger comparatitis, which is what I call the disease of the soul that you get from comparing yourself to another woman. And that comparatitis fuels negative self-talk. So consider those filtered Instagram pics from someone you haven't seen since high school, and they make you feel like you're old and wrinkly and kind of frumpy in comparison to theirs, and somehow you suddenly start thinking you're less worthy. But where's that story coming from? Is it actually true? Those questions may help you realize those negative thoughts about yourself that often aren't facts, but a result of cultural or childhood conditioning. So for example, sometimes we internalize the voice of a critical parent. Okay, so if your mother, for example, had low self-esteem and beat herself up when she made mistakes, or the father who was quick to point out his perceived physical flaws, they might project those voices onto you. You might hear them. So breaking into generational patterns is hard to do, but it can be a really empowering step in cultivating self-love. It's kind of exciting to realize that negative patterns, like being severely critical of your body or your abilities, they can stop with you. My mum put me on a diet at the age of 4. I recently discovered that this was because my brother had been to a childminder and she was now putting me with a childminder. So she had to make it a point to the childminder that I was not to eat any sugary food so that I didn't get fat or fatter. And it was her belief about how her son was badly treated by this childminder and he gained weight. She then projected it onto me and the childminder I was going to, and started being hypercritical about my weight because she was so overly concerned that she'd done this to her other child by leaving him with somebody else after school, that it wasn't going to happen to me. What then happened was the critical voice about my weight came from her. So I ended up yo-yo dieting for a lot of my life because I was never good enough if I was slightly overweight. Because, you know, as I said, she put me on this diet at the age of 4. So self-love isn't about blaming ourselves. It's not about blaming our parents. It's not about blaming our caregivers. It's possible that she did the best, or they did their best that they could at the time, and you didn't just get what you needed, but when you were little. But we're not responsible for the ways in which we were hurt, misunderstood, or neglected by our parents, by our caregivers, by anyone at school. That's not our responsibility. Okay, but it is our responsibility as fully grown women to address and adjust the coping strategies we develop to deal with that pain. So learning to accept what happened in the past so you can move through it, okay? And you can grow closer to self-love. But it starts with looking at the facts, not dramatizing them, and not putting 2 and 2 together and getting 695. Look at the facts. Like, you start thinking you're a bad mum. Are you a bad mum, though? Are your children safe, loved? Do they know they're safe? Do they know that loved? And do you take care of their needs? Yes. So where are you a bad mum? Are you with me? So it's really important to practice self-love by looking at the facts of things, knowing what we're responsible for, knowing what we're not responsible for, knowing if there's evidence for something, knowing that there isn't evidence for something, and not taking responsibility for critical voices that were given to us by other people, but being responsible for stopping it here. Okay, hope that helps. I will see you tomorrow for day 22. Take care, my darlings. Bye.